Hello, horror lovers. If spine-chilling true stories are your nightly ritual, you've come to the right place. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying true stories, make sure to subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to me. Don't forget to like this video and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps us bring you the best in real horror storytelling. Turn off your lights, look under your bed. Don't listen to this while sitting in the bathroom. And if you have a weak heart, stop this video now. Let's get into the stories. The old asylum had been abandoned for decades, its once grand architecture now a crumbling relic of a bygone era. Situated on the outskirts of town, it loomed like a ghostly sentinel, its broken windows and sagging roof telling stories of decay and neglect. Despite the warnings and local legends about the place, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. It was an opportunity to delve into the unknown and uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. On a chilly autumn morning, I set out with a few friends, armed with flashlights and cameras. We had heard tales of strange occurrences and paranormal activity associated with the asylum, but we were eager to see for ourselves. The overgrown path leading to the asylum was shrouded in fog, giving the area an otherworldly atmosphere. As we approached the main entrance, the sheer size of the building was imposing. The iron gates were rusted and slightly ajar, and the air was thick with an unsettling quiet. We exchanged nervous glances, but pressed on, pushing open the heavy doors and stepping into the darkness beyond. The interior was a labyrinth of broken furniture, scattered medical equipment, and peeling paint. The air was stale, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. We moved cautiously through the corridors, our flashlights cutting through the darkness and casting long shadows on the walls. We made our way to the old treatment rooms, their once sterile environments now filled with remnants of the past. There were old examination tables, dusty charts, and abandoned wheelchairs. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of abandonment, and a chill seemed to permeate the air. As we explored, we began to hear faint noises, soft whispers, and distant footsteps that seemed to echo through the halls. We tried to dismiss them as a result of the building's natural decay, but the sounds grew more pronounced and unnerving. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, and at times we could hear the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving just out of sight. One of my friends, Sarah, called out to us from another part of the building, "Guys, you need to see this." Her voice was tinged with excitement and a hint of fear. We followed her to a large room that had once been the asylum's main dining hall. The space was vast, with high ceilings and long, dusty tables. At the far end of the room, Sarah had discovered a collection of old photographs and documents scattered across a table. The photographs depicted patients and staff from decades ago, their expressions ranging from vacant stares to eerie smiles. As we examined the photographs, we noticed something disturbing. In several of the pictures, there were strange, shadowy figures in the background, shapes that didn't seem to belong in the photographs. We couldn't explain them, but they added an unsettling element to our exploration. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and we felt a cold draft sweeping through the space. Our breaths became visible in the icy air, and the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a low, mournful wail. We looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. A sudden crash from one of the nearby rooms made us jump. We rushed to investigate and found that an old cabinet had toppled over, its contents scattered across the floor. As we began to pick up the items, we heard a faint, sorrowful moon coming from the darkness. Our flashlights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move and shift. We were on edge, our nerves frayed by the strange occurrences. We decided it was time to leave, but as we made our way back toward the entrance, we noticed something horrifying. The hallways we had previously walked through seemed to have changed. The layout of the asylum was shifting, with corridors leading to places we hadn't seen before and doors that had appeared where none had been. It was as if the building itself was alive, shifting and contorting to keep us trapped. In a state of panic, we retraced our steps, desperately trying to find the way out. The whispers turned into anguished cries, and the temperature continued to plummet. It felt as if we were being pursued by an unseen force, the air growing heavy with malevolence. Finally, we stumbled upon a door that led outside. We burst through it and into the fresh air, gasping for breath and looking back at the asylum. The building loomed behind us, its dark windows like empty eyes watching us leave. We made our way back to our vehicles, shaken but relieved to be out of the asylum's grasp. The experience left a lasting impression on us. The abandoned asylum was a place of sorrow and darkness, its history marked by suffering and tragedy. We had ventured into the heart of that darkness and had come face to face with something that defied explanation. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had not only explored a physical place, but had also touched upon something more profound and unsettling. The asylum had revealed its secrets to us, and those secrets would forever remain a haunting reminder of the shadows that lurk in forgotten places. The announcement came on a crisp March evening. The government declared a nationwide lockdown due to a rapidly spreading virus. We were told to stay indoors, avoid contact with others, and only leave our homes for essentials. It felt like a surreal dream, but the fear in the eyes of the officials on TV made it clear this was real. I lived alone in a small apartment in the heart of the city. My family was miles away, and my friends were scattered across different neighborhoods. We kept in touch through video calls and messages, but the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The city that never slept was now eerily quiet, the streets deserted, the hustle and bustle replaced by an unsettling stillness. The first week was bearable. I stocked up on supplies, worked from home, and tried to keep a routine. But as the days turned into weeks, the isolation started to take its toll. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me, and the silence became deafening. I tried to stay busy, but there were only so many movies to watch, books to read, and puzzles to solve. One night, about a month into the lockdown, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the usual silence. Then I heard it again, a dull, rhythmic thudding coming from the apartment above mine. I checked the time. To 13 a.m. Who could be making such a racket at this hour? I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the noise continued, growing louder and more insistent. Frustrated, I got out of bed and walked to my living room, where I could hear it more clearly. It sounded like someone was banging on the floor with a heavy object. I grabbed my phone and called the building manager, Mr. Thompson. It rang several times before he picked up, his voice groggy and irritated. "Hello, Mr. Thompson, it's Alex from 4B. There's a loud noise coming from the apartment above mine. It's been going on for a while now." There was a pause, and then he sighed. "I'll check it out. Stay in your apartment and keep your door locked." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a little better. But as I sat there, waiting for the noise to stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The thudding continued, and I started to notice other sounds, soft whispers, the creak of floorboards, and the faint sound of footsteps. After what felt like an eternity, the noise finally stopped. I let out a sigh of relief and went back to bed, hoping to get some rest. But as I lay there, I heard something else, a soft tapping on my window. I live on the 4th floor, and there was no balcony. My heart pounded as I slowly turned my head to look. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint outline of a figure standing outside. The tapping continued, growing more urgent. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But the tapping was real, and it wasn't stopping. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. 911. What's your emergency? There's someone at my window, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I live on the 4th floor, and there's no balcony. Please, send someone quickly. The operator assured me that help was on the way and advised me to stay on the line. I sat there, clutching my phone, my eyes glued to the window. The figure outside remained still, the tapping growing softer until it finally stopped. Minutes later, I heard a knock on my door. Police, open up. I rushed to the door and opened it, relieved to see 2 officers standing there. I explained what had happened, and they immediately went to check the window. But when they pulled back the curtains, there was nothing there. No signs of anyone outside. No footprints. Nothing. We'll do a sweep of the building, one of the officers said. Stay inside and lock your door. I nodded, my mind racing. As they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I closed and locked the door, then sat down on the couch, trying to calm my nerves. The next morning, I received a call from Mr. Thompson. He apologized for the noise and assured me that he had checked the apartment above mine for C. It was empty. The tenant had moved out just before the lockdown, and no one had been there since. My blood ran cold. If the apartment was empty, then who or what had been making the noise? Over the next few days, things got worse. I started hearing strange noises at all hours, whispers, footsteps, and the occasional tapping on my window. I tried to ignore it, but the fear was always there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One night I decided to investigate. I waited until the noises started, then grabbed a flashlight and quietly made my way to the apartment above mine. The door to 4 Celsius was slightly ajar, which was odd since it was supposed to be empty. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The apartment was cold and empty, the air thick with an unpleasant odor. I moved slowly, checking each room, but found nothing out of the ordinary. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft whisper behind me. Help us. I spun around, my flashlight shaking. The room was empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more desperate. I backed away, my heart pounding, and stumbled out of the apartment. I ran back to my own apartment, locking the door behind me. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears. I tried to drown them out with music, but they only grew louder, more insistent, desperate for answers. I did some research on the building. I discovered that years ago there had been a fire in the apartment above mine. A family had lived there, a mother, father, and 2 children. They had all perished in the fire. Their bodies never recovered. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The noises, the whispers, they were the spirits of the family trapped in the building, trying to reach out for help. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave because of the lockdown, and I couldn't stay because of the haunting. The isolation was driving me to the brink of madness. I decided to try and communicate with the spirits, hoping to find some way to help them move on. That night I sat in my living room, the lights dimmed, and called out to the spirits. "I know you're here. I want to help you. Please, tell me what you need." The room grew cold, and the whispers started again. This time they were clearer, more coherent. They told me about the fire, about their pain and suffering, and how they couldn't find peace. They needed closure, a proper farewell. I lit a candle and offered a prayer for the family, asking for their souls to find peace. As I did, the room seemed to lighten, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. The whispers grew softer, and the cold receded. That night I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The spirits had found some measure of peace, and the haunting had ceased. The lockdown continued, but the fear and isolation were no longer overwhelming. I felt a connection to the family, a sense of having helped them find the peace they deserve. When the lockdown finally ended, I moved out of the apartment, unable to stay in a place with such a dark history. But I'll never forget the experience, the sense of being trapped with restless spirits, and the realization that even in the darkest times, there is always hope. The cabin had been in our family for generations, a secluded retreat nestled deep in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was a place of peace and tranquility, a haven from the chaos of the modern world. I had spent countless summers there as a child, exploring the forest, swimming in the lake, and roasting marshmallows over the campfire. It was a place filled with happy memories, but that changed one fateful weekend. I had recently gone through a rough patch in my life, losing my job, a painful breakup, and the passing of my grandmother, who had always been my rock. Needing a break from it all, I decided to spend a few days at the cabin. It seemed like the perfect place to clear my head and find some solace. I packed my bags and drove up to the cabin, arriving just before dusk. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. The cabin looked just as I remember it, rustic and charming, with a large porch overlooking the forest. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards greeting me. I spent the first evening unpacking and getting settled. I lit a fire in the fireplace, cooked a simple meal, and enjoyed the quiet. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and owls. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. The forest was beautiful, the trees towering overhead, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. I followed a familiar trail, taking in the sights and sounds of nature. It was rejuvenating, exactly what I needed. As the sun began to set, I headed back to the cabin. I was about halfway there when I noticed something strange, a feeling of being watched. I stopped and looked around, but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off the unease, I continued on my way. That night, as I sat by the fireplace, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, but it grew louder, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I stood up and peered out the window, but the darkness was impenetrable. I couldn't see anything beyond the porch. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I decided to call it a night and went to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would calm my nerves. I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud bang. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The cabin was silent, but the feeling of unease was stronger than ever. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the living room. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I was certain I had locked it before going to bed. I walked over and closed it, making sure to lock it this time. As I turned around, the flashlight beam caught something on the floor, muddy footprints leading from the door to the fireplace. But my blood ran cold. Someone had been inside the cabin. I checked every room, but there was no sign of anyone. The footprints stopped at the fireplace, which was still burning low. I added more wood to the fire, hoping the light would keep whatever or whoever was out there at bay. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the fire, my flashlight in hand, listening to every creak and rustle. The hours dragged on, and just as dawn was breaking, I heard it again, the soft rustling outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Summoning my courage, I opened the front door and stepped outside. The forest was still, the morning light casting long shadows. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I called out, but my voice sounded small and uncertain in the vast silence. I spent the day on edge, trying to shake off the fear. I went for another hike, hoping the exercise would clear my mind, but the sense of being followed never left me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. As night fell, I decided to keep the fire burning bright and stay awake. I sat in the living room, the flashlight and a heavy wrench by my side, listening to the forest outside. The noises started again, faint at first, but growing louder. The footsteps returned, pacing around the cabin, the floorboards creaking under the weight. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and wrench, flung open the door, and stepped outside, ready to confront whatever was out there. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "Show yourself." There was no response, just the rustling of leaves. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but saw nothing. The forest was empty, or so it seemed. I took a few steps forward, my heart pounding, and then I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. The silence was suffocating, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I took another step back, and then another, until I was back on the porch. "Stay away from me," I shouted, slamming the door shut and locking it. I sat by the fire, my back against the wall, the flashlight and wrench clutched tightly. The footsteps continued, pacing around the cabin, the figure circling like a predator. I could hear its breathing, slow and deliberate. Just outside the window, the night seemed to stretch on forever. I kept the fire burning, the light flickering against the walls. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the windows. The footsteps were gone, the forest quiet and peaceful once more. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove away as fast as I could. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. I never went back to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I told my family about what had happened, but they just chalked it up to my overactive imagination and the stress I had been under. Maybe they were right, but I know what I saw, what I felt. The cabin still stands, a silent witness to whatever lurks in those woods. I've heard stories from others, hikers and campers, about strange noises and eerie feelings. No one has seen the figure, but the sense of being watched is a common theme. I try to move on, to forget that weekend, but the memories are always there, lurking at the edges of my mind. Every time I hear a creak or a rustle, I'm taken back to that cabin, to the figure in the shadows, to the feeling of being watched. And I know, deep down, that some places are better left undisturbed. When I was a student at St. Mary's High School, there were always rumors about the old, unused wing of the building. It was a part of the original structure built in the early 1900s, long abandoned after a newer section was added. The doors were always locked, and it was strictly off-limits to students, but that only added to its allure. Whispers of ghostly apparitions and eerie sounds circulated among us, fueling our teenage curiosity and fear. I never paid much attention to the stories until my senior year. That's when strange things started happening. It began with little incident objects disappearing and reappearing in odd places, lockers slamming shut on their own, and cold spots in the hallways. Most of us laughed it off as pranks or overactive imaginations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One Friday afternoon, my friends and I decided to investigate. It was the last day of school before winter break, and the halls were nearly empty. We figured it was the perfect time to explore the Forbidden Wing. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, we made our way to the old section of the school. The door to the abandoned wing was surprisingly easy to open. The lock was rusted and brittle, and with a bit of force it gave way. We stepped inside, the air instantly cooler and filled with the musty scent of decay. Dust motes danced in the beams of our flashlights as we moved cautiously down the hallway. The old wing was a time capsule of the past, lockers covered in layers of dust, faded posters on the walls, and desks and chairs haphazardly stacked in the classrooms. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence enveloped us, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional creak of the floorboards. We reached the end of the hallway, where the principal's office used to be. The door was ajar, and as we pushed it open, a chill ran down my spine. The room was untouched, as if frozen in time. Papers were scattered across the desk, and an old rotary phone sat in its cradle. But what caught my eye was a large, dusty mirror hanging on the wall. My friend Mia, always the boldest of the group, walked up to the mirror and wiped away the grime. As she did, her reflection flickered, and for a brief moment I saw another face, a young girl with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. I blinked, and she was gone, replaced by Mia's startled reflection. "Did you see that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, too shocked to speak. The air grew even colder, and I felt a presence in the room watching us. I turned around, my flashlight sweeping the shadows, but there was nothing there. Suddenly the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all screamed, our flashlights flickering wildly. The room plunged into darkness, and a chilling wind swept through, rustling the papers and knocking over the chair. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. Panic set in, and we rushed to the door, pulling and banging on it, but it wouldn't budge. The oppressive feeling grew stronger, and I could hear faint whispers like voices from another time. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. "Please, let us out," Mia cried, her voice echoing in the darkness. As if in response, the door slowly creaked open. We didn't waste a second and bolted out of the room, down the hallway, and back to the newer part of the school. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath in the crisp winter air. We never spoke about what happened that day, not to each other or anyone else, but the experience haunted me, lingering in my mind like a dark shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something in that old wing, something that wasn't meant to be awakened. Years later, after graduating and moving away, I heard that the old wing of St. Mary's was finally demolished. There were no ceremonies, no announcements, just a quiet dismantling of a piece of the school's history. But I knew deep down that the spirits of that place wouldn't be laid to rest so easily. Every now and then I dream of the haunted hallways, the flickering lights, and the sorrowful face in the mirror, and I wonder if, somewhere in the ruins of the old wing, the spirits still linger, waiting for the next group of curious souls to stumble upon their restless domain. It was late, and I was exhausted. My flight had been delayed, and by the time I landed and collected my bags, it was well past midnight. I just wanted to get home, take a hot shower, and crawl into bed. The airport was nearly deserted, and the cold, empty corridors echoed with my footsteps. I pulled out my phone and requested an Uber. Within minutes, I received a notification. My driver, Mark, was on his way. I headed outside to the pickup area, shivering in the cold night air. The streets were eerily quiet. The occasional car passing by, a black sedan, pulled up, and the driver rolled down the window. "David?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, relieved to see him. "Great, hop in," he said with a friendly smile. I threw my bags in the back seat and climbed in. The car was warm, and soft music played from the radio. I buckled my seatbelt and settled in for the ride. Mark was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and a kind face. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror as we pulled away from the curb. "Long flight?" he asked. "Yeah, delayed for hours," I said, stifling a yawn. "Sorry to hear that." "We'll get you home in no time," he assured me. The city lights blurred past as we drove through the quiet streets. I closed my eyes, letting the gentle hum of the engine lull me into a half-sleep. But after a while, I noticed something odd. We seemed to be heading in the wrong direction. Double quote some. "Excuse me, but I think you're going the wrong way," I said, sitting up and checking the map on my phone. "Oh, don't worry," Mark replied smoothly. "I know a shortcut. It'll save us some time." I wanted to trust him, but a nagging feeling of unease settled in my stomach. I watched the buildings become fewer and fewer as we drove into a more desolate area of the city. The street lights grew sparse, and the roads became narrower. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice tinged with worrying. "Absolutely," he said, but there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. We turned onto a dirt road, and I felt a surge of panic. This wasn't right. "Listen, I really think we should turn around," I insisted, my heart racing. Mark's friendly demeanor shifted. His eyes grew cold, and a sinister smile spread across his face. "Just relax, David. We're almost there." I reached for my phone, but he snatched it from my hand and threw it into the front seat. "You won't be needing that," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. My mind raced, and fear clawed at my throat. I had to get out of there. I glanced around, looking for something to use as a weapon, but the car was spotless, with nothing within reach. As we drove deeper into the darkness, the reality of my situation sank in. I was trapped with no way to call for help. My only chance was to stay calm, look for an opportunity to escape. "Please, just let me go," I pleaded, my voice shaking. Mark laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, we're just getting started," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. The car came to a stop in front of an old, abandoned warehouse. My heart pounded as Mark got out and walked around to my side. He opened the door, and I seized the moment. I kicked him as hard as I could and bolted out of the car. I ran into the darkness, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. The cold night air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I could hear Mark's footsteps behind me, getting closer. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to keep running. I spotted a narrow alleyway and darted into it, hoping to lose him. The alley was dark and filled with debris, but I pressed on, my only thought to get away. I could hear Mark cursing and stumbling behind me. I reached the end of the alley and found myself in a small, empty courtyard. There was nowhere to go. I frantically searched for an escape route, but the high walls and locked gates left me trapped. I turned to face Mark, who was now blocking the entrance, a sinister grin on his face. "You can't run forever," he taunted, stepping closer. Desperation gave me strength. I grabbed a loose brick from the ground and hurled it at him. He dodged it, but it gave me a split second to make a run for it. I sprinted past him, back the way I came, hoping to find another way out. I could hear his footsteps behind me, relentless and determined. I burst out of the alley and onto the main road, frantically waving my arms and shouting for help. A car approached, and I threw myself in front of it, forcing it to stop. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked at me in shock. "Please help me," I begged, yanking open the door and jumping in. "He's trying to kill me." She glanced past me at Mark, who was standing at the edge of the road, his face twisted with rage. Without a word, she slammed on the gas, and we sped away. I looked back, expecting to see Mark chasing after us, but he was gone. The woman drove me to the nearest police station, where I told my story. The officers were skeptical at first, but when they checked my Uber account and found Mark's details, their expressions changed. They launched an investigation and discovered that Mark wasn't an Uber driver at all. He had somehow hacked into the system and posed as one, targeting unsuspecting passengers. There had been other reports of similar incidents, but none as terrifying as mine. The police eventually found the abandoned warehouse, but Mark was nowhere to be seen. They warned me to be cautious and assured me they were doing everything they could to catch him. But I knew deep down that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. The experience left me traumatized. I couldn't shake the memory of Mark's cold, predatory eyes and the feeling of being hunted. I stopped using ride-sharing services and became hyper-vigilant, always looking over my shoulder. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal, but the fear never fully went away. Every time I stepped outside at night, I felt a chill, a reminder of that terrifying midnight ride to nowhere. And I knew, in the back of my mind, that Mark was still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I had always been a skeptic, dismissing supernatural stories and conspiracies as mere figments of imagination. But that changed the night I stumbled upon something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. It started with an innocuous invitation to a friend's wedding in a small, remote town called Hollow Creek. The town was picturesque, with charming cottages and scenic views, but there was an undercurrent of unease among the locals. They spoke in hushed tones about the old church on the edge of town, a place most avoided. My friend, Jessica, had moved to Hollow Creek a few months prior and had invited me to her wedding. Curious about her new life and eager to catch up, I accepted the invitation. When I arrived, I was struck by the town's eerie tranquility. The wedding was lovely, a small gathering of close friends and family. But as the evening progressed, Jessica's behavior became increasingly peculiar. During the reception, Jessica pulled me aside, her face pale. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered urgently. "I've been seeing things, strange things, people watching me." I don't know who to trust anymore. Before I could ask for more details, Jessica's fiancé, a man named Andrew, intervened. "Everything's fine, Jess, you're just stressed. Let's not worry about it tonight." The evening ended without incident, but Jessica's words haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to investigate the church that everyone seemed so wary of. It was an old, Gothic structure, its stone walls covered in creeping ivy. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping inside. The interior was dimly lit, with shafts of sunlight piercing through the stained glass windows. Dust motes floated in the air, and the silence was palpable. I wandered through the main hall, taking in the dusty pews and the altar at the far end. It was then that I noticed a strange symbol etched into the floor in front of the altar, a complex, interlocking pattern of circles and runes. I was about to leave when I heard a noise from the back room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the source of the sound. As I neared the door, I heard muffled voices chanting, rhythmic and hypnotic. My heart raced, but I pushed the door open just a crack. Inside, I saw a group of people gathered around an altar, dressed in dark robes. They were chanting in an unfamiliar language, their voices blending into a haunting melody. In the center of the room was a large, ornate book, open to a page filled with more strange symbols. I was about to retreat when one of the robed figures turned and looked directly at me. Their eyes were voids of darkness, and a shiver ran down my spine. I backed away slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. As I turned to leave, I bumped into a stack of crates, causing a loud crash. The chanting stopped abruptly. I bolted out of the church, my heart pounding. I raced back to the wedding reception, only to find that Jessica and Andrew were nowhere to be seen. I asked around, but no one seemed to know where they had gone. Panic set in as I realized I might be too late to help her. I spent the next few hours searching for any sign of Jessica. I checked the local and the town's small shops, and even knocked on a few doors, but no one had seen her. As night fell, I returned to the church, driven by a sense of urgency. The building was dark and silent, the door now securely shut. Desperate, I searched for another way in. I found a small window at the back of the church, barely large enough for me to squeeze through. I slipped inside, landing softly on the dusty floor. The chanting had resumed, louder and more fervent than before. I crept toward the back room and peered through a crack in the door. The cult members were still there, their ritual in full swing. Jessica was bound to the altar, her eyes wide with fear. Andrew stood among the robed figures, his face a mask of cold determination. I realized that the ritual was not just a random act of craziness, it was a sacrificial ceremony, and Jessica was the intended victim. My blood ran cold as I understood the gravity of the situation. I had to do something, but what? I spotted a metal pipe lying in the corner of the room. With trembling hands, I picked it up and readied myself. As I pushed open the door, I shouted, "Let her go." The cult members turned in surprise, and Andrew's face twisted into a snarl. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice cold and menacing. I swung the pipe at the nearest cult member, hitting him squarely. The room erupted into chaos as the cult members scrambled to defend themselves. I fought my way through, doing my best to avoid the blows aimed at me. I reached Jessica and quickly untied her, pulling her off the altar. "Run," I shouted, guiding her toward the window. We squeezed through and dropped down to the ground outside. I helped her to her feet, and we ran through the darkened streets, not stopping until we were safely away from the church. We made our way to the local police station, where we reported the incident. The officers were skeptical but agreed to investigate. They found the church abandoned with no sign of the cult members or Andrew. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find any trace of them, and the case went cold. Jessica and I left Hollow Creek the next morning. The experience had left us both shaken, and we vowed never to return. The memory of the darkened church, the chanting, and the cold eyes of the cult members haunted me. Years later, I still think about that night. I wonder if the cult members ever resurfaced or if they vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only whispers of their dark rituals. One thing is certain, the cult of the Forgotten Hollow will always remain a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk beyond the veil of normalcy. Hollywood is a place of dreams, glamour, and fame. It's where stars are born and legends are made. But beneath the glitz and glamour, there lies a darker side, one that even the brightest stars cannot escape. This is the story of a renowned actress who encountered something far more terrifying than the pressures of fame. Jennifer Hart was at the peak of her career. With multiple blockbuster movies and a string of awards, she was living the dream. Her talent and beauty had made her a household name, and she was beloved by fans worldwide. Despite her success, Jennifer craved privacy and solace away from the public eye. She found it in an old mansion tucked away in the Hollywood Hills, a secluded retreat where she could escape the constant scrutiny. The mansion was a stunning piece of architecture with sprawling gardens and a view of the city that was unparalleled. It had been vacant for years, but Jennifer was drawn to its charm and history. She purchased the property and moved in, excited to make it her sanctuary. It wasn't long before Jennifer began to notice strange occurrences. At first, there were subtle a flickering light, a cold draft in the hallways, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. She dismissed these as quirks of an old house, but the incidents grew more frequent and unnerving. One evening, after a long day on set, Jennifer returned home to find her bedroom door wide open. She was certain she had closed it before leaving. She entered the room cautiously, her heart pounding. The room was exactly as she had left it, except for one thing. A photo of her late grandmother that she kept on her nightstand was now lying face down on the floor. Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. She picked up the photo and placed it back on the nightstand, trying to convince herself it had been knocked over by a draft. But as the days went by, more objects began to move on their own. Books would fall off shelves, lights would turn on and off, and doors would creak open without explanation. One night, Jennifer was awoken by a soft whispering sound. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers were faint but distinct, coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping cautiously into the hall. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew cold. She could see her breath misting in front of her. As she turned to go back to bed, she saw a shadow move at the end of the hallway. It was tall and human-like, but there was something off about it. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a glitch in a film reel. Jennifer's heart raced as she called out, "Who's there?" There was no response. The shadow vanished, and the house fell silent once more. Jennifer retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She lay awake for the rest of the night, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The following day, she decided to confide in her close friend, Rachel, who had a keen interest in the paranormal. Rachel suggested bringing in a professional to investigate the house. Skeptical but desperate for answers, Jennifer agreed. The paranormal investigator, a man named Dr. Andrew Collins, arrived the next day. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, had an air of authority. He brought with him an array of equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors. He conducted a thorough investigation of the mansion, spending hours in each room searching for signs of paranormal activity. As night fell, Dr. Collins set up cameras and recorders throughout the house. He explained to Jennifer that they would leave the equipment running overnight and review the footage in the morning. Jennifer agreed, though the thought of spending another night in the house filled her with dread. That night, Jennifer experienced the most terrifying encounter yet. She was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when she felt a sudden pressure on her chest, as if something heavy was pressing down on her. She tried to move, but found herself paralyzed. Panic set in as she struggled to breathe. The room grew colder, and she heard the whispers again, this time right next to her ear. Through sheer willpower, she managed to break free from the paralysis and bolted upright. The pressure lifted, and the whispers stopped. She turned on every light in the room, her hands trembling. She spent the rest of the night sitting on her bed, clutching her phone and waiting for morning to come. Dr. Collins returned the next day to review the footage. As they watched the recordings, they saw several unexplained phenomena, doors opening and closing on their own, shadowy figures moving through the rooms, and disembodied voices captured on the audio recorders. One piece of footage showed the shadowy figure standing at the foot of Jennifer's bed, watching her as she slept. Dr. Collins concluded that the mansion was indeed haunted, likely by multiple spirits. He believed that the activity might be linked to the property's history, stories of tragic deaths, and unresolved grievances. He suggested a cleansing ritual to help put the spirits to rest. With the help of a local spiritualist, Jennifer and Dr. Collins performed the ritual. They burned sage, recited prayers, and invited the spirits to move on to the next realm. The activity in the house decreased significantly, and Jennifer finally began to feel at peace in her home. Despite the frightening experiences, Jennifer chose to stay in the mansion. She believed that the spirits had been seeking attention, and now that their stories had been acknowledged, they could rest. The mansion became her sanctuary once more, a place where she could find solace and inspiration. Jennifer's story became a topic of fascination among her fans and the media, but she rarely spoke about it in detail. It was a deeply personal experience that had changed her perspective on life and the unknown. She continued to live in the mansion, cherishing its history and the sense of peace that had finally settled over it. The Hollywood Hills mansion, once a place of fear and uncertainty, became a symbol of resilience and understanding. Jennifer learned to embrace the mysteries of the world and found a deeper connection to the past and the spirits that inhabit it. Her encounter with the supernatural had transformed her, leaving her with a profound respect for the unseen forces that shape our lives. The year was 2020, and the world had come to a standstill. The pandemic had locked us all indoors, and the only sounds outside were the occasional sirens and the eerie silence of deserted streets. I was a nurse working at Willow Creek Hospital, a place that had quickly become a front-line battleground against the virus. The hospital was always busy, but during the lockdown, it took on a different, more sinister atmosphere. I remember that night vividly. The hospital was unusually quiet, almost deserted. We were operating with a skeleton crew due to the virus, and the few patients we had were spread out across different wings to prevent the spread of infection. I was on the night shift, assigned to the old, nearly abandoned wing of the hospital, which was used as an overflow area for known COVID patients. The old wing had always creeped me out. It was built in the early 1900s, and the outdated architecture and flickering lights gave it an unsettling vibe. The patients housed there were mostly elderly, and many rooms were empty, their beds covered in dust sheets. It felt like walking through a ghost town. My shift started normally enough. I checked on my patients, administered medication, and completed my rounds. Around midnight, as I was making my way down the dimly lit corridor, I heard a faint, muffled cry. It was coming from one of the empty rooms. I hesitated for a moment, then steeled myself and walked towards the sound. The door to room 13 was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway. I called out, but there was no response. I checked the corners and the bathroom, but it was empty. I chalked it up to my imagination and closed the door. As I continued my rounds, the feeling of unease grew. The hospital seemed to be playing tricks on me, lights flickering, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, and the constant sense of being watched. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my work. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take a break. I made my way to the break room, which was at the far end of the old wing. The corridors were eerily silent, the only sound being the echo of my footsteps. As I approached the break room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. It was a woman, her long hair hanging down her face, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. She was standing perfectly still, watching me. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly to one side. I took a step forward, but she vanished into thin air, as if she had never been there at all. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly turned and hurried back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to check on my patients again, hoping the routine would calm my nerves. As I entered one of the rooms, I found an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong, Mrs. Thompson?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was a woman in my room," she whispered, her voice trembling. She was standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me. A shiver ran through me. "Did she say anything?" Mrs. Thompson shook her head. "No, she just stood there, and then she disappeared." I reassured her as best as I could, but my mind was racing. Was the figure I saw the same one Mrs. Thompson described? I decided to keep an eye on her room for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. The next night, I was back on duty in the old wing. The sense of unease had only grown stronger, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. Around midnight, I heard the muffled cry again, this time from room 9. I rushed to the room and found it empty, just like before. As I stood there, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I felt a cold breeze brush past me. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw her again, the same woman, standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. This time I didn't wait to see if she would vanish. I ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding. I wasn't the only one experiencing strange things. My colleagues reported seeing shadowy figures, hearing disembodied voices, and feeling sudden drops in temperature. The old wing had a reputation for being haunted, but most of us had dismissed it as superstition until now. One night I was on my break when I heard a loud crash coming from the storage room. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way there. The door was slightly open, and as I pushed it wider, I saw the shelves had collapsed, scattering medical supplies across the floor. As I started to clean up, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw the woman's face pale with hollow eyes inches from mine. Then she was gone, and the room was silent. I reported the incidents to my supervisor, but they were skeptical. They suggested it was the stress of working during the pandemic, combined with the old wing's creepy atmosphere. But I knew what I had seen, and so did my colleagues. We started sharing our experiences, piecing together the story of the ghostly nurse. According to hospital legend, she was a nurse who had worked at Willow Creek during the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. She had succumbed to the virus, but her spirit never left the hospital. She was said to roam the old wing, watching over patients and staff. We decided to do something about it. One of my colleagues, Sarah, suggested holding a small ceremony to acknowledge the ghost and offer peace. We gathered in the old wing one night, armed with candles and a sense of solidarity. We lit the candles and placed them in a circle, standing together in the flickering light. Sarah spoke softly, addressing the ghost. "We know you're here. We acknowledge your presence and the sacrifices you made. We're asking you to find peace and let us continue our work without fear." For a moment, the air grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. Then, slowly, the temperature returned to normal, and the candles burned steadily. We stood there in silence, feeling a sense of calm wash over us. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences in the old wing lessened. The ghostly sightings became rare, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. It was as if the spirit had found some measure of peace, and we were able to carry on our work without fear. The lockdown eventually ended, and life at Willow Creek Hospital returned to a new kind of normal. But I will never forget those nights in the old wing and the ghostly nurse who watched over us. She remains a reminder of the past and the sacrifices made by those who came before us. It all started with an antique shop on the edge of town, a place filled with curiosities and relics from bygone eras. I had always been drawn to such places, fascinated by the stories each item seemed to whisper. On a lazy Saturday afternoon, I decided to explore the shop, unaware that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. The shop was a treasure trove of oddities, dusty books, old paintings, and peculiar trinkets. As I wandered through the aisles, an ornate amulet caught my eye. It was a beautiful piece, made of silver and adorned with intricate carvings and a large, deep blue gemstone at its center. There was something mesmerizing about it, a sense of power that seemed to emanate from the very core of the gem. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a knowing smile, noticed my interest. "Ah, you found the amulet," he said. "It's a very special piece, with a long and mysterious history." I asked him to tell me more, and he shared a tale that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. According to the legend, the amulet had been crafted by a sorcerer centuries ago. It was said to possess great power, but it came with a curse. Anyone who wore it would be granted their deepest desire, but at a terrible cost. Intrigued and undeterred by the warning, I decided to buy the amulet. The shopkeeper hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to dissuade me, but ultimately he relented and wrapped it up for me. As I left the shop, he called out, "Be careful what you wish for. That evening I examined the amulet more closely, admiring its craftsmanship. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for me, that it had somehow found its way into my life for a reason. With a mix of curiosity and skepticism, I decided to wear it, hoping that the legend was true and that it would bring some excitement into my life. The change was almost immediate. I began to experience an uncanny string of good luck, unexpected promotions at work, financial windfalls, and even a chance encounter with someone I had long admired. It seemed as though my deepest desires were indeed being fulfilled, and I couldn't have been happier. But soon the darker side of the curse began to reveal itself. It started with small, unsettling occurrences, items disappearing from my home, strange noises in the middle of the night, and a sense of being watched. I dismissed these as coincidences, but as time went on, the incidents grew more disturbing. One night I was jolted awake by the sound of someone whispering my name. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. The figure was indistinct, a mass of darkness that seemed to shift and flicker. I reached for the light, but the figure vanished before I could illuminate the room. The next morning I found scratches on the walls and furniture, as if something with claws had been trying to get in. My once peaceful home now felt like a haunted house, filled with an oppressive sense of dread. I realized that the amulet's power came with a price. A malevolent force had been unleashed, and it was growing stronger. Desperate to rid myself of the curse, I returned to the antique shop, hoping the shopkeeper could help. But when I arrived, I found the shop closed and boarded up. It was as if it had never existed. Panic set in as I realized I was on my own. I began to research the amulet's history, hoping to find a way to break the curse. I discovered stories of others who had worn it, each tale ending in tragedy. It seemed that the only way to break the curse was to pass the amulet on to someone else, but I couldn't bring myself to condemn another person to the same fate. As the days turned into weeks, the malevolent presence grew more aggressive. It tormented me relentlessly, whispering dark thoughts and filling my dreams with nightmares. I became a shell of my former self, constantly on edge and consumed by fear. In my darkest moment, I decided to seek the help of a renowned spiritualist known for her ability to banish evil spirits and break curses. She agreed to see me and instructed me to bring the amulet to her. The spiritualist's home was filled with the scent of burning sage and candles, creating an atmosphere of calm and protection. She examined the amulet carefully, her expression grave. "This is a powerful artifact," she said, "but it is tainted by dark magic. We must perform a cleansing ritual to break the curse." The ritual was elaborate and intense, involving chants, herbs, and sacred symbols. As the spiritualist worked, I felt a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. The air grew heavy with energy, and the amulet began to vibrate in her hands. The room filled with an otherworldly light, and I felt the oppressive presence lift. When the ritual was complete, the spiritualist handed me the amulet, now cleansed of its dark power. "The curse is broken," she said, "but you must never wear this amulet again. Its power is too dangerous." I thanked her profusely and left, feeling a weight lifted from my shoulders. I buried the amulet deep in the woods, far away from anyone who might find it. My life slowly returned to normal, the dark presence gone, and my home peaceful once more. The experience left me with a profound respect for the unseen forces that shape our world. I had learned the hard way that some desires come at too high a cost, and that true happiness cannot be bought with shortcuts or dark magic. I often think back to that fateful day in the antique shop and the shopkeeper's warning. Be careful what you wish for. It's a lesson I will never forget, a reminder that some doors should remain closed and some relics should stay buried. The dense forest of Pine Hollow was known for its tranquility, a sanctuary for those seeking solace in nature's embrace. But it also held secrets, whispered among the rustling leaves and the ancient trees that towered over the winding paths. My name is Ethan, and my friends and I discovered the dark heart of Pine Hollow in the summer of 2018. It was a spontaneous trip, one we had planned during a late-night conversation filled with laughter and beer. I was joined by my girlfriend, Lisa, and our close friends, Mark and Jenna. We packed our camping gear and drove to Pine Hollow, eager to escape the city's noise and stress. Little did we know we were heading straight into a nightmare. The first day was perfect. We set up our campsite near a serene lake, the water reflecting the clear blue sky. We spent the day hiking, swimming, and enjoying each other's company. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, a soothing symphony that lulled us into a false sense of security. It was around midnight when we first heard it, a distant, mournful wail that echoed through the trees. We fell silent, listening intently. "What was that?" Jen asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Probably just an animal," Mark replied, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the eerie sound had unsettled us. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. Sleep did not come easily. The forest, which had seemed so inviting during the day, now felt oppressive and sinister. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig outside our tent made my heart race. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it again, the wail, closer this time, followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on the forest floor. I sat up, my pulse quickening. "Lisa, did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, I think someone's out there." I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the surrounding trees. I saw nothing but shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. There was no response, just the whispering wind and the distant call of an owl. I returned to the tent, trying to convince myself it was just our imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, we found strange footprints around our campsite. They were large, with a peculiar, almost human-like shape, but distorted and elongated. "What the hell made these?" Mark muttered, examining the prints. "I don't know, but I don't like it," Lisa replied, her voice shaky. We decided to cut our trip short and head back. As we packed our gear, a sense of urgency drove us to move quickly. The forest, once a place of beauty and peace, now felt like a trap. We set off on the trail back to our car, but something was off. The path seemed different, the landmarks unfamiliar. It was as if the forest had shifted, leading us deeper instead of out. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. "We must have taken a wrong turn," Jenna said, trying to stay calm. "Let's retrace our steps." We backtracked, but the trail continued to elude us. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows that twisted and danced among the trees. Exhausted and scared, we decided to set up camp for the night and try again in the morning. As darkness enveloped us, the forest came alive with unsettling sounds. The wail we had heard the previous night returned, louder and more insistent. It was followed by whispers, indistinguishable yet chilling, as if the trees themselves were speaking to us. We huddled around the campfire, the flickering flames our only protection against the encroaching darkness. "This place is cursed," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Just as he finished speaking, the fire abruptly died, plunging us into darkness. The temperature dropped, and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. We could barely see each other, let alone the forest around us. Then we saw them shadowy figures moving through the fog, their forms indistinct, but undeniably human. They circled our campsite, their movements slow and deliberate. We heard the footsteps again, crunching on the forest floor, accompanied by that dreadful wail. Lisa clutched my arm, her grip tight. "Ethan, what are those?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice trembling. "But we need to stay together." The figures drew closer, and I realized they weren't walking, they were gliding, as if floating above the ground. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and their faces were twisted into grotesque masks of anguish. One of the figures reached out towards us, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I stumbled back, pulling Lisa with me. "Run," I shouted, and we bolted into the forest, leaving our gear behind. We ran blindly through the fog, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. The wails and whispers followed us, growing louder and more frantic. I could hear Lisa sobbing beside me, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. After what felt like hours, we burst out of the fog and into a clearing. The moonlight illuminated a small, dilapidated cabin at the center. Desperate for shelter, we rushed inside and barricaded the door. The cabin was old and abandoned, filled with dust and cobwebs, but it offered a temporary respite from the horrors outside. We collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. "What the hell is happening?" Jenna cried, her face pale with terror. "I don't know," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "But we need to find a way out of this forest." Mark looked out the window, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Do you think those things will follow us here?" "I don't know," I said, "but we can't stay here forever." We decided to take turns keeping watch while the others rested. I volunteered for the first shift, my eyes fixed on the door, my ears straining for any sound. The hours dragged by, and I fought to stay awake. Just before dawn, I heard a noise outside the cabin, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I peered through a crack in the door and saw one of the figures standing just outside, its eyes glowing in the pre-dawn light. It raised a hand and tapped on the door again, a slow, deliberate knock. I backed away, my heart pounding. "Wake up, we need to go now." The others stirred, their faces etched with fear. We gathered what little strength we had left and prepared to make a run for it. As we unblocked the door, the tapping stopped, and the figure vanished. We stepped outside, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The fog had lifted, and the forest seemed almost normal again. We set off at a brisk pace, determined to find the main trail. Hours later, we finally stumbled upon a familiar path. Relief washed over us as we realized we were close to the edge of the forest. We quickened our pace, the sense of dread lifting with each step. When we reached our car, we were exhausted but grateful to be alive. We left Pine Hollow without looking back, the memory of that night seared into our minds. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in Pine Hollow. Were they spirits of the forest, or something else entirely? All I know is that the forest holds its secrets closely, and some trails are best left unexplored. It was my first week on the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, a sprawling old building with a long history. As a new nurse, I was eager to prove myself. but I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that seemed to hang in the air. The hospital had its fair share of ghost stories, and I had heard enough from my colleagues to know that Ward 13 was at the center of many of them. Ward 13 was located in the oldest part of the hospital, a section that had been in use since the early 1900s. It was seldom used now, only open when the hospital was at full capacity. The patients assigned to Ward 13 were often those in long-term care, people who were too ill or injured to be transferred elsewhere. That night, the ward was home to only a handful of patients, all of whom were in critical condition. I was assigned to Ward 13 along with two other nurses, Maria and David, as the night wore on. We took turns checking on the patients, administering medication, and ensuring that everything was in order. The atmosphere in the ward was eerie, the dim lighting casting long shadows on the walls. Around midnight, I heard the sound of soft crying coming from one of the rooms. I assumed it was one of the patients and went to check. The room was empty, the bed neatly made, and the monitors silent. The crying continued, faint but persistent. I followed the sound down the hallway, but it seemed to vanish into thin air. I returned to the nurse's station. Puzzled, Maria was there, reading a book. "Did you hear that?" I asked her. "Hear what?" she replied. Looking up the crying, I said, "It was coming from one of the rooms, but there was no one there." Maria's expression darkened. "Oh, that. We've all heard it at some point. They say it's the ghost of a patient who died here years ago, still crying for help." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but the crying had sounded so real. I tried to push the thought out of my mind and focus on my work. Later that night, I was making my rounds when I heard a strange noise coming from the end of the hallway. It was a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and insistent. I walked toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. The tapping grew louder as I approached room 13, a room that had been empty for months. I hesitated at the door, my heart pounding. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. The tapping had stopped, and the room was silent. I turned to leave when I noticed something strange, a set of footprints on the dusty floor, leading from the bed to the window and back again. I bent down to examine the footprints more closely. They were small, like those of a child. I stood up quickly, a sense of unease creeping over me. The hospital had no pediatric ward, and there were no children in the building. I left the room, closing the door firmly behind me. Back at the nurse's station, I told David about the footprints. He frowned, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Years ago, a little girl died in that room. She had a rare disease, and her parents were with her every night, holding her hand. After she passed, the room was sealed off for a long time. But sometimes people say they see her footprints or hear her laughter." I stared at him, trying to process what he had just told me. The logical part of my mind refused to believe it, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The following night, I was again assigned to Ward 13. I was on edge, every noise and shadow making me jump. Around 2 a.m., the power went out, plunging the ward into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow over the corridor. I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming toward the nurse's station. I called out, thinking it was one of the other nurses, but there was no response. The footsteps grew louder, and I saw a figure approaching, a man in an old-fashioned hospital gown, his face pale and eyes hollow. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, staring with a blank expression. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. The power came back on, and the corridor was empty. I ran to find Maria and David, both of whom looked equally shaken. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Maria nodded. We all saw it. "That was Dr. Reynolds. He was a surgeon here years ago, known for his unorthodox methods. He disappeared one night, and his body was never found. Some say he still wanders the halls, looking for his lost patients." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The rational part of my mind struggled to make sense of it, but the evidence was undeniable. We spent the rest of the night together, too afraid to be alone. In the days that followed, I researched the history of Ward 13. I found records of numerous unexplained deaths, disappearances, and ghost sightings. It seemed that the ward had been cursed from the beginning, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. I continued to work at St. Mary's, but I avoided Ward 13 whenever possible. The experiences I had there left a lasting impression on me, a reminder that some places are touched by forces beyond our understanding. To this day, the haunting of Ward 13 remains one of the most chilling experiences of my life. The hospital is still in operation, and Ward 13 is still used when necessary, but those who work there know to tread carefully, for the spirits of the past are never far away, waiting in the shadows, ready to make their presence known. I've always been a horror movie enthusiast. There's something exhilarating about the thrill of a good scare, the way it sends shivers down your spine and keeps you on the edge of your seat. So when I heard about a special screening of a supposedly cursed film at the old Regal Theater, I couldn't resist. I convinced my friends Alex, Megan, and Chris to join me. We didn't know that night would change our lives forever. The Regal Theater was a relic of the past, an Art Deco building with a history of ghost sightings and strange occurrences. It had been closed for years, only reopening for special events like this one. The film being screened was an obscure 1970s horror movie called The Haunting of Blackwood Manor. Rumor had it that everyone involved in the production had met untimely deaths, and the film itself was said to be cursed. We arrived at the theater just before midnight. The marquee, dimly lit and flickering, gave the place an eerie ambience. A small crowd had gathered, most of them horror aficionados like us. The air was thick with anticipation and a hint of fear. Inside, the theater was just as I imagined, old, musty, and full of character. The seats were worn, the screen slightly yellowed with age, but it added to the charm. We found seats near the middle, the perfect spot to fully immerse ourselves in the experience. As the lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life, a hush fell over the audience. The opening credits rolled, accompanied by a haunting melody that set the tone for what was to come. The film was a slow burn, the tension building with every scene. It told the story of a family tormented by malevolent spirits in their ancestral home, Blackwood Manor. Halfway through the film, strange things started happening. It began subtly, an odd flicker on the screen, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I shrug it off as part of the theater's old charm, but then the shadows in the film seemed to move independently of the characters, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. I glanced at my friends. Alex looked intrigued. Megan seemed nervous, and Chris had a skeptical smirk. "Just special effects," Chris whispered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. As the movie reached its climax, the temperature in the theater dropped noticeably. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I could see the same mist forming in front of my friends. Suddenly, the screen went black. The projector had stopped, leaving us in pitch darkness. A murmur of confusion rippled through the audience. Technical difficulties, someone suggested, but their voice was drowned out by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the theater. I turned to look, but saw nothing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Panic set in. People began to fidget in their seats, some getting up to leave. But the doors wouldn't budge, no matter how hard they pushed. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, each one more frantic and desperate than the last. Suddenly, the screen flickered back to life, but instead of the movie, it showed the audience. The grainy, black and white image revealed us sitting in the theater, our expressions frozen in fear. It was like watching ourselves from the perspective of some unseen observer. Then the camera panned to the back of the theater, where a dark figure stood. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured. The figure moved closer, the camera following its every step. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it was heading straight for us. The figure stopped just behind the last row of seats. It reached out a skeletal hand, and the lights flickered on, revealing the figure standing in the aisle right in front of us. Gasps and screams filled the air as the figure vanished, leaving behind a lingering sense of dread. The screen cut to black again, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. I grabbed Megan's hand, my own trembling. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely audible over the noise. Alex and Chris nodded, and we made our way to the nearest exit. This time the door gave way, and we stumbled out into the night. The cold air was a welcome relief, but the sense of being watched didn't leave us. We hurried to the car, our footsteps echoing in the empty streets. As we drove away, the theater loomed in the rearview mirror, its marquee now dark. None of us spoke, the weight of what we had experienced hanging heavily in the silence. In the days that followed, strange things continued to happen. At home, objects moved on their own, lights flickered, and we all had the same recurring nightmare, the dark figure standing at the foot of our beds, watching us with hollow eyes. Desperate, we sought out answers. We found an old article about the film and the supposed curse. It mentioned a seance conducted during the movie's production, an attempt to summon spirits for authenticity. The seance had gone horribly wrong, unleashing something dark and malevolent. Determined to break the curse, we decided to perform a cleansing ritual, hoping to banish whatever we had awakened. We gathered at my place, armed with sage, candles, and a sense of desperation. Following instructions we found online, we chanted incantations, the smoke of the burning sage filling the room. For a moment it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. But then the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more furious than ever. In the flickering light of a single match, we saw the dark figure standing in the corner of the room. It moved closer, its presence suffocating. We held hands, continuing to chant, our voices trembling with fear. The figure stopped, its hollow eyes fixed on us. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a final, guttural whisper, it vanished. The candles flared back to life, and the room was silent. We sat there, breathing heavily, unsure if we had truly succeeded. But over the next few days, the strange occurrences stopped. The nightmares faded, and the sense of being watched disappeared. We never spoke of that night again. The experience left us shaken, a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. I still love horror movies, but now I'm more careful about what I watch and where. The curse of the haunting of Blackwood Manor taught me that some things are best left in the shadows. The life of a celebrity is often envied by many a world of glamour, fame, and fortune. But beneath the glitzy facade, there are moments of unspeakable terror that even the brightest stars cannot escape. This is the story of Thomas Parker, an acclaimed actor known for his powerful performances and charismatic presence, who faced a horror that left him forever changed. Thomas Parker was at the pinnacle of his career. With numerous awards and a legion of devoted fans, he was a household name. His latest project was a highly anticipated play, a revival of a classic tragedy set to open at the historic Grand Royal Theatre. The theatre, built in the early 1900s, was renowned for its grandeur and rich history. It was also rumored to be haunted. The cast and crew of the play were abuzz with excitement as they prepared for the opening night. Rehearsals went on late into the night, and Thomas often stayed behind to perfect his scenes. The theater's atmosphere, with its ornate architecture and dim lighting, only added to the sense of mystery and intrigue. One evening, as Thomas was rehearsing alone on stage, he felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop drastically, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. He dismissed it as a draft, though the feeling of being watched lingered. As he continued his monologue, he heard a faint whispering sound. It was barely audible, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder and more distinct. He stopped, listening intently, but the whispering ceased. Shaking off his unease, he resumed his practice, only to be interrupted again by the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty auditorium. Thomas scanned the dark rows of seats, but there was no one there. The footsteps seemed to move closer, growing louder with each step. His heart pounded as he called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was silence. Determined to ignore the strange occurrences, Thomas continued his rehearsals in the days leading up to the opening night. However, the disturbances became more frequent and unnerving. Props would move on their own, lights would flicker, and shadows would flit across the stage. The cast and crew began to whisper about the theater's ghost, a legend that had persisted for decades. The story went that the Grand Royal was haunted by the spirit of a former actor, Edward Hawthorne, who had died tragically on stage during a performance. It was said that his restless spirit still roamed the theater, seeking revenge for his untimely death. Many claim to have seen his apparition or heard his anguished cries echoing through the halls. Opening night arrived, and the theater was packed with eager spectators. Thomas stood backstage, trying to calm his nerves. As the curtain rose, he stepped onto the stage, delivering his lines with his usual brilliance. The audience was captivated, hanging on his every word. But as the play progressed, Thomas began to feel an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew thick, and he could hear the whispering again, louder and more insistent. His fellow actors seemed oblivious, their performances unaffected by the growing tension. During a particularly intense scene, Thomas felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if an invisible hand had reached out and grabbed him. He gasped, clutching his chest, and stumbled backward. The audience watched in stunned silence, unsure if this was part of the performance. Suddenly, a ghostly figure appeared on stage beside Thomas. It was a translucent form, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a look of anguish on its face. The figure reached out toward Thomas, its eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The audience gasped, some screaming, as the apparition vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Thomas collapsed to the floor, the pain in his chest unbearable. The curtain fell, and the cast and crew rushed to his aid. He was taken to the hospital, where doctors determined that he had suffered a heart attack. The incident was attributed to the stress of opening night, but Thomas knew better. During his recovery, Thomas couldn't shake the image of the ghostly figure. He began to research the history of the Grand Royal Theatre, uncovering more about Edward Hawthorne's tragic end. Hawthorne had been a talented actor whose career was cut short by a heart attack during a performance. He had been on the verge of a major breakthrough, and his death had left a dark cloud over the theater. Determined to find closure, Thomas sought the help of a renowned medium, Madame Celeste. She agreed to conduct a séance at the theater, hoping to communicate with Hawthorne's spirit and bring him peace. The séance was held in the dead of night, the theater eerily quiet and empty. Madame Celeste set up a circle of candles on the stage and began her incantations. Thomas sat beside her, feeling a mix of fear and anticipation. The air grew cold, and the candles flickered as if a breeze had passed through the room. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and a heavy presence filled the air. Madame Celeste's voice grew stronger, calling out to Edward Hawthorne's spirit. The room was filled with a palpable tension, and Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Then a voice echoed through the theater, soft and mournful. "Why do you disturb me?" the voice asked. It was the same voice Thomas had heard whispering during his rehearsals. Madame Celeste responded gently, "Edward, we seek to help you find peace. Why do you linger here?" The ghostly figure of Edward Hawthorne appeared once more, his form shimmering in the candlelight. "I was robbed of my chance," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I was meant for greatness, but my life was cut short." Thomas stepped forward, his heart aching for the tortured spirit. "Edward, I understand your pain, but holding on to this place will only keep you trapped. You deserve to find rest and move on." The spirit looked at Thomas, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I have watched you perform. You remind me of myself. Perhaps in your success I can find the peace I seek." With that, the figure of Edward Hawthorne began to fade, the air growing warmer and lighter. The candles burned steadily, and the oppressive presence lifted. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him, knowing that the spirit had finally found peace. The next day, Thomas returned to the Grand Royal Theatre, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The play went on, and his performance was hailed as one of his best. The strange occurrences ceased, and the theater returned to its former glory. Thomas's encounter with the supernatural left a lasting impression on him. He often spoke of it in interviews, attributing his success to the spirit of Edward Hawthorne. The Grand Royal Theatre became known not only for its history and beauty, but also for the ghostly presence that had finally found peace. To this day, Thomas Parker remains one of the most beloved actors of his generation, his story a reminder that even in the world of glamour and fame, there are forces beyond our understanding that shape our lives and destinies. The world had come to a standstill. The COVID-19 pandemic had forced everyone into isolation, and our apartment complex was no exception. My name is Natalie, and I had been living alone in my small one-bedroom apartment for months. The loneliness was stifling, but what I didn't realize was that solitude was about to be the least of my worries. It all started innocuously enough. One night I was scrolling through social media, trying to distract myself from the monotony of lockdown life, when I heard a faint tapping sound. At first, I dismissed it as the creaking of the old building, but as the days passed, the noise became more frequent and distinct, always coming from the wall behind my bed. My curiosity got the better of me, and one evening I decided to investigate. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source of the tapping. It sounded rhythmic, almost like Morse code. I tapped back, unsure of what I was expecting. To my surprise, the tapping ceased. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to cabin fever and tried to ignore it. But the next day, something strange happened. I found a note slipped under my door. It was a piece of old, yellowed paper with a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Help me, I'm trapped." My heart raced as I read the note. Was someone playing a prank on me, or was there really someone trapped in the building? I decided to ask my neighbors if they had noticed anything unusual. Most of them brushed me off, too absorbed in their own struggles with the lockdown. But Mr. Thompson, the elderly man in 34C, gave me a knowing look. "You're in 34B, aren't you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes, why?" I reply, feeling a chill run down my spine. He sighed and shook his head. "This building has a history. They say the previous tenant of your apartment disappeared under mysterious circumstances. People claim to hear strange noises and receive messages like the one you got. The police never found any evidence, and the case went cold." I felt a knot in my stomach. Was I living in a haunted apartment? That night I couldn't sleep. The tapping resumed, louder and more insistent than before. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I got out of bed and started pacing the room, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. Hesitant, I opened it. The message was a single word: "Help." I felt a surge of panic. Who was sending these messages, and how were they doing it? My apartment was locked from the inside, and I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave in days. Desperate for answers, I decided to search the apartment for any hidden clues. I combed through every nook and cranny, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Then I remembered the crawl space above the bathroom ceiling. I had never been up there, but it was the only place left to check. I grabbed a flashlight and a chair and carefully climbed up. The crawl space was cramped and dusty, filled with cobwebs and debris. As I moved the flashlight around, something caught my eye. It was an old, leather-bound journal, partially hidden under a pile of insulation. I grabbed it and climbed down, eager to see what it contained. The journal belonged to the previous tenant, a woman named Sarah. Her entries detailed her descent into madness, driven by the same tapping and messages that I had been experiencing. She wrote about a dark presence in the apartment, something malevolent that seemed to feed off her fear. Her last entry was a chilling plea for help, followed by a series of frantic, illegible scribbles. As I read her words, I felt a cold breeze brush past me. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. It seemed to come from all around me, filling the room with an oppressive sense of dread. I dropped the journal and backed away, my heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, forming words that sent shivers down my spine. "Leave this place, or suffer the same fate." I grabbed my phone and called the building manager, Mr. Perez. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, but I hoped he would believe me. When he arrived, I showed him the journal and told him everything that had been happening. He listened patiently, his expression growing more serious with each word. "This isn't the first time I've heard stories like this," he admitted, "but I've never had any proof until now." He agreed to let me stay in a vacant apartment on a different floor while he investigated further. As I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved quickly, eager to leave 3 for B behind. That night I slept fitfully in the new apartment. The silence was a welcome relief, but I knew it was only temporary. The next morning, Mr. Perez called me to his office. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept at all. I went through the crawl space and found more journals, he said, all from previous tenants of 3 for B. They all experienced the same thing: tapping, whispers, messages. Some of them disappeared, and others, well, they didn't end well. He handed me a box filled with the journals. I think you should read these. Maybe you can find a pattern, something we can use to stop this. I spent the next few days poring over the journals, piecing together the history of 3 for B. The stories were eerily similar, each tenant describing a dark presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. One entry, however, stood out. It was from a man named Jacob, who claimed to have performed a ritual to banish the entity. According to Jacob, the ritual required specific items: salt, candles, and a personal item from each previous tenant. I contacted Mr. Perez, and we gathered what we needed. The personal items were the hardest to find, but we managed to collect something from each journal: a locket, a watch, a photo, and a ring. On the night of the full moon, we returned to 3 for B to perform the ritual. The air was thick with tension, and the apartment felt colder than ever. We lit the candles and drew a circle of salt, placing the personal items in the center. As we chanted the incantation from Jacob's journal, the room grew darker, and the air felt heavy. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing, but we continued, our voices steady despite the fear that gripped us. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I almost lost my nerve, but we pressed on, chanting louder and faster. Then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the darkness lifted. The candles flared back to life, and the whispers ceased. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive presence that had filled the apartment was gone. We had done it. The entity was banished, and 3 for B was finally at peace. I moved back into the apartment, grateful to have my home back. The tapping never returned, and the whispers were a distant memory, but the experience left a mark on me. I still love horror movies, but now I know that sometimes the real horror is closer than we think, and sometimes the things we fear most are the ones we can't see. I didn't waste any time. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove away as fast as I could. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. I never went back to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I told my family about what had happened, but they just chalked it up to my overactive imagination and the stress I had been under. Maybe they were right, but I know what I saw, what I felt. The cabin still stands, a silent witness to whatever lurks in those woods. I've heard stories from others, hikers and campers, about strange noises and eerie feelings. No one has seen the figure, but the sense of being watched is a common theme. I try to move on, to forget that weekend, but the memories are always there, lurking at the edges of my mind. Every time I hear a creak or a rustle, I'm taken back to that cabin, to the figure in the shadows, to the feeling of being watched. And I know, deep down, that some places are better left undisturbed. We sat by the fire, clutching our makeshift weapons, a hiking pole and a heavy branch. The night dragged on, every rustle and snap of a twig setting our nerves on edge. Finally, just before dawn, the noises ceased, and the forest was quiet once more. Exhausted and shaken, we decided to break camp and try to find our way back. The morning light brought little comfort as we trudged through the dense forest, our sense of direction all but gone. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but we found no sign of the main trail. As afternoon turned to evening, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown path. Desperate, we decided to follow it, hoping it would lead us to safety. The path wound through the forest, the trees pressing in close on either side. The air grew colder, and the sense of unease returned, stronger than before. We came to a clearing, and at its center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, and the door hanging off its hinges. But it was shelter, and we were desperate. We approached cautiously, calling out, but there was no response. Inside, the cabin was musty and filled with debris. We found an old stove, a rickety table, and the broken chairs. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We decided to spend the night there, hoping to find the main trail in the morning. As darkness fell, we built a fire in the stove and tried to make ourselves comfortable. The cabin creaked and groaned in the wind, and the sense of being watched returned. Sarah and I took turns keeping watch, our nerves frayed by the events of the past 2 days. Around midnight, the temperature plummeted, and a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the cabin. The fire flickered and sputtered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I was on watch when I heard a soft whispering, barely audible, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a chorus of voices murmuring just out of reach. I shook Sarah awake, and we listened in terrified silence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until we could make out words our names, repeated over and over. The sound was maddening, a cacophony that seemed to seep into our very bones. We decided we couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. We grabbed our backs and fled into the night, the whispers following us into the fog. We stumbled through the forest, our flashlight beams barely cutting through the thick mist. The sense of being watched intensified, and we could hear footsteps behind us, keeping pace with our frantic flight. Just as we were about to collapse from exhaustion, we broke through the fog and found ourselves on the main trail. Relief washed over us, and we quickened our pace, determined to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had been stalking us. We reached the trailhead at dawn, collapsing in the safety of our car. As we drove away, we vowed never to speak of the events of that weekend. The wilderness had shown us its dark side, a malevolent force that defied explanation. To this day I can't explain what happened in the Pine Ridge Mountains. The whispers, the growls, the sense of being watched, these memories haunt my dreams, a reminder of the terror we faced. I still love hiking, but I am much more cautious now, wary of the unknown lurking in the depths of the forest. The cabin by Shallow Lake had always been a family retreat, a place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. Nestled deep in the woods, it offered tranquility, breathtaking views, and the promise of adventure. But this time it would offer something much darker. My name is Ethan, and this is the story of how our peaceful family retreat turned into a nightmare. It was the first week of October, and the air was crisp with the onset of autumn. My wife, Lisa, and our 2 kids, Emily and Jake, were excited for a weekend getaway. We packed our bags, loaded up the car, and made the 3-hour drive to the cabin. The drive was uneventful, filled with laughter and anticipation. None of us had any idea what awaited us. As we approached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the lake. The cabin looked as picturesque as ever, a quaint wooden structure with a stone chimney and a wraparound porch. We unpacked the car, settled in, and decided to explore the surroundings before nightfall. Emily and Jake ran ahead, their laughter echoing through the trees. Lisa and I followed, taking in the beauty of the forest. The leaves were a riot of colors, reds, oranges, and yellows, creating a mesmerizing tapestry. We walked along the edge of the lake, skipping stones and enjoying the peace and quiet. As dusk settled in, we headed back to the cabin. I started a fire in the fireplace, and we gathered around for a cozy evening. We roasted marshmallows, told stories, and played board games. It was the perfect start to our weekend, but as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling settled over me. After tucking the kids into bed, Lisa and I sat on the porch, sipping hot cocoa and watching the stars. The lake was still, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. It was beautiful, yet there was something unsettling about the silence. It felt too quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. I brushed off my undies and went to bed, hoping for a good night's sleep. But my dreams were anything but restful. I found myself in a dark forest, chasing after a shadowy figure. No matter how fast I ran, the figure always stayed just out of reach. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The next morning I tried to shake off the nightmare. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and exploring the woods. Emily found a small old cemetery hidden among the trees. The gravestones were weathered and covered in moss, the names barely legible. A shiver ran down my spine as we stood there, the air thick with an inexplicable sense of dread. Jake, always the curious one, asked about the cemetery's history. I had no answers, but promised to look it up later. We left the cemetery and continued our hike, but the eerie feeling lingered. That night, the unease returned. As we sat by the fire, strange noises echoed through the woods, whispers carried by the wind, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. Lisa noticed it, too. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my eyes scanning the dark forest. "Probably just animals," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. We decided to call it a night and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I got up, careful not to wake Lisa, and peeked through the window. The moon cast long shadows across the yard, but I saw nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cool night air sending chills down my spine. I walked around the cabin, shining the light into the woods. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I was about to go back inside when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinguishable. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move or respond. I took a step forward, and it vanished, melting into the darkness. I stood there, frozen with fear, before rushing back inside and locking the door. Lisa woke up, sensing my distress. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up in bed. I told her about the figure, and she looked just as scared as I felt. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. The next day, we tried to act normal for the kids' sake, but the sense of dread was palpable. We decided to cut our trip short and head back home. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. On the drive back, I did some research on my phone about the cemetery and the history of Shadow Lake. What I found was chilling. According to local legends, The cemetery belonged to a family that had lived in the area in the late 1800s. They were rumored to be involved in dark rituals and witchcraft. The family met a tragic end, and their spirits were said to haunt the woods, seeking revenge on anyone who disturbed their resting place. I shared the information with Lisa, and we both agreed that we would never return to the cabin. As beautiful as it was, the history and the experiences we had were too unsettling. Back home, life returned to normal, but the memories of that weekend lingered. Occasionally, I would have nightmares about the shadowy figure, and Emily and Jake would talk about the strange noises they heard. We never spoke about it to anyone else, fearing they would think we were crazy. Months later, I received a call from the new owners of the cabin. They had found my number in a guest book we had left behind. They wanted to know if we had experienced anything unusual during our stay. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, I told them the truth. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We've been hearing strange noises at night," the new owner admitted, "and last night we saw a figure standing by the lake. We thought it was just our imagination, but now I'm not so sure." I advised them to leave the cabin and not look back. The curse of Shadow Lake Cabin was real, and whatever haunted those woods wasn't going to rest any time soon. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of relief knowing that we weren't alone in our experiences, but I also felt a deep sense of sadness for the spirits trapped in those woods, forever bound to a place of darkness and despair. Our family had escaped, but the shadow of Shadow Lake Cabin would always haunt us. The film industry is no stranger to strange occurrences, but what happened on the set of Shadows in the Dark went beyond mere coincidence. It was my first big break as a director, and I was eager to make a name for myself in the horror genre. The script was perfect, a chilling tale of a haunted house that seemed almost too real. Little did I know the line between fiction and reality would blur in terrifying ways. The house we chose as our primary location was an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion's dilapidated state and Gothic architecture made it the perfect backdrop for our film. We began shooting in late October, hoping to capture the eerie atmosphere of the season. From the moment we set foot in the house, there was a palpable sense of unease. The air was heavy, and the temperature seemed to drop the moment we crossed the threshold. The cast and crew brushed it off as nerves and excitement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. On the first day of shooting, strange things began to happen. Our lead actress, Emily, was preparing for a scene in which she had to walk down a dark hallway. As the cameras rolled, she froze, her eyes wide with fear. She claimed to have seen a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall, watching her. We reviewed the footage, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway. The incidents escalated as the days went by. Lights would flicker and go out without warning. Equipment would malfunction, and cold spots would appear in random parts of the house. The crew reported hearing whispers and footsteps when no one was around. Objects would move on their own, and doors would slam shut with no explanation. One night, we were shooting a particularly intense scene in the basement, where the characters discover the source of the haunting. The basement was dark and damp, with an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into our bones. As we set up the shot, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over us. We began filming, and everything was going smoothly until one of the actors, Mark, suddenly screamed and collapsed to the floor. He was clutching his chest, gasping for air. We called for an ambulance, but by the time it arrived, Mark was unconscious. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors determined that he had suffered a heart attack. He later told us that he had felt an overwhelming sense of fear, as if something had been squeezing his heart. The incident shook us all, but we were determined to finish the film. We took extra precautions, bringing in a priest to bless the set and performing cleansing rituals to ward off any negative energy. For a while, things seemed to calm down, and we were able to continue filming without further incidents. However, the piece was short-lived. One evening, I was reviewing footage in the editing room when I noticed something strange. In several scenes, there were anomalies faint, ghostly figures in the background, faces appearing in mirrors, and shadows moving on their own. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a glitch in the equipment, but the more I watched, the more convinced I became that something was haunting our film. I decided to keep the anomalies in the final cut, thinking they would add to the film's eerie atmosphere. But as the release date approached, the cast and crew began to experience more intense paranormal activity. Emily reported waking up in the middle of the night to find a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. Another crew member claimed to have been pushed down a flight of stairs by an unseen force. The most terrifying incident happened during the film's premiere. We had rented out a historic theater in the heart of the city, inviting the press and fans to the first screening. The theater was packed, and there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. As the lights dimmed and the film began to play, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. But halfway through the screening, the film suddenly stopped, the screen going black. The audience murmured in confusion, and I rushed to the projection room to find out what had happened. The projectionist was pale and trembling, pointing to the projector. The film reel had melted, as if it had been exposed to intense heat. We were able to get the backup reel and resume the screening, but the atmosphere had changed. The audience was on edge, and I could feel a sense of foreboding. As the film reached its climax, the temperature in the theater dropped dramatically, and a heavy silence fell over the room. When the final scene played the characters confronting the malevolent spirit in the haunted house, a chill ran down my spine. The ghostly figure that appeared on screen was not part of the original footage. It was a woman, her face twisted in anguish, staring directly at the camera. The audience screamed, and the lights flickered and went out. Panic ensued, and people rushed for the exits. I stood frozen, staring at the screen, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. When the lights finally came back on, the theater was empty, save for a few scattered belongings and overturned chairs. In the days that followed, reports of strange occurrences continued. People who had attended the premiere claimed to have seen the ghostly woman in their homes, in mirrors, and even in their dreams. The film itself was plagued by technical difficulties, with copies becoming corrupted and screenings being disrupted by unexplained phenomena. I tried to make sense of it all, but there was no logical explanation. The house we had filmed in was abandoned and eventually torn down, its dark history buried beneath new construction. The film, Shadows in the Dark, became a cult classic, known as much for its terrifying content as for the real-life horror that plagued its production. To this day, I can't watch the film without feeling a sense of dread. The ghostly woman still haunts my dreams, her anguished face a constant reminder of the terror we faced. The experience left me with a deep respect for the unknown and a belief that some stories are better left untold. It was my senior year at Crestwood High, a typical suburban school with its fair share of drama and cliques. My name is Mia, and I had always heard whispers about the school being haunted, but I never gave it much thought. That all changed during the fall semester when my friends and I decided to explore the old, abandoned wing of the school. The east wing had been closed off for years, ever since a tragic accident that no one really talked about. Rumor had it that a student named Emily had died there under mysterious circumstances. The details were always vague, but the stories were enough to keep most students away. Naturally, my friends and I, being the curious and somewhat reckless group we were, saw it as the perfect adventure. One crisp October afternoon, we gathered our courage and made our way to the east wing. There was Chris, the class clown, Sarah, the skeptical one, Josh, our resident history buff, and me. We slipped through the broken gate that led to the overgrown courtyard, our excitement tinged with nervous laughter. The east wing was a stark contrast to the rest of the school. The windows were boarded up, and the air felt colder, heavier. As we stepped inside, the floorboards creaked under our feet, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Dust particles danced in the beams of our flashlights, adding to the eerie atmosphere that we wandered through the darkened halls, our footsteps echoing off the walls. The lockers were rusted shut, and old, faded posters clung to the walls. We came across a classroom with desks still arranged in neat rows, as if waiting for students who would never return. Josh, ever the historian, began recounting the legend of Emily. She was a bright student, popular and well-liked, but she harbored a dark secret. One day she disappeared, and a week later her body was found in one of the classrooms in the east wing. The official cause of death was an accident, but many believed she had been murdered. As he spoke, a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, we heard a faint sobbing sound. We froze, our eyes darting around the room. The sobbing grew louder, echoing through the hall. Chris, always the brave one, whispered, "It's probably just the wind," but we all knew it wasn't. The sound was too clear, too human. We followed the nose, our hearts pounding in our chests. It led us to a classroom at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. We pushed it open, and there, in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was a girl, her back to us, her long hair cascading down her shoulders. She wore a white dress, tattered and stained. The sobbing continued, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and fear. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure slowly turned, and we were met with the hollow, empty eyes of a ghost. Her face was pale, her expression one of torment. We stood there, paralyzed with fear, as she began to move towards us, her footsteps silent on the dusty floor. Chris grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. "Run!" he yelled, and we bolted out of the room, the ghostly figure closed behind. We dashed through the halls, not daring to look back. The sobbing grew fainter, but the sense of dread lingered. We burst out of the east wing, gasping for breath, our faces pale with fear. We didn't stop running until we were back in the safety of the main building. Collapsing on the steps, we tried to make sense of what we had seen. Sarah, the skeptic, was the first to speak. That was real, wasn't it?" Josh nodded, his face grim. "It was Emily. There's no other explanation. We made a pact that day never to speak of what we had seen, but the experience haunted us. We could never forget the hollow eyes, the overwhelming sadness, and the sense that we had intruded on something we couldn't understand. The weeks that followed were a blur of normal school activities, but the east wing remained in the back of our minds. We started noticing strange things: cold drafts in warm rooms, flickering lights, and whispers in empty halls. It seemed that Emily's spirit was not confined to the east wing alone. One evening, I stayed late to finish an art project. The school was nearly empty, the hallways dimly lit. As I worked, I heard footsteps outside the art room. I looked up, expecting to see a janitor or another student, but the hall was empty. I shrugged it off and went back to my project. A few minutes later, the temperature in the room dropped. I shivered and glanced around, feeling uneasy. The lights flickered, and I heard the faint sound of sobbing again. My heart raced as I remembered our encounter in the east wing. I gathered my things, ready to leave, when I saw a shadow move across the wall. Panic set in, and I bolted for the door. As I reached the hallway, I saw her Emily standing at the end, her hollow eyes fixed on me. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and I could barely breathe. "Please," I whispered, "leave me alone." She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, her presence a reminder of the tragedy that had befallen her. I ran down the hall, not stopping until I was outside, the cool night air filling my lungs. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The next day I told Chris, Sarah, and Josh about what had happened. They listened, their faces pale with fear. We realized that Emily's spirit was restless, and we needed to do something to help her find peace. We did some research and discovered that Emily's death had never been properly investigated. The case had been closed quickly with many questions left unanswered. We decided to visit her family, hoping they could shed some light on what had happened. Emily's mother welcomed us into her home, her eyes filled with sadness. She told us about Emily's life, her dreams, and the events leading up to her death. She believed her daughter had been murdered, but the police had dismissed her claims. "We need to find out the truth," Josh said, determination in his voice. "Emily deserves justice." We spent the next few weeks digging through old records, talking to former teachers and students, and piecing together the events of that fateful day. What we found was shocking. Emily had been involved in a secret relationship with a teacher, Mr. Lawson. When she tried to end it, he became violent. Fearing for her life, she had hidden in the east wing, but he found her. In a fit of rage, he pushed her, and she fell, hitting her head on the edge of a desk. Mr. Lawson had covered up the accident, making it look like Emily had fallen on her own. The school administration, eager to avoid a scandal, had gone along with the story. Armed with this new information, we went to the police. The case was reopened, and Mr. Lawson was arrested. The truth finally came to light, and Emily's name was cleared. Her family could finally grieve properly, knowing that justice had been served. After the truth was revealed, the strange occurrences at Crestwood High stopped. The cold drafts, flickering lights, and whispers ceased. It was as if Emily's spirit had finally found peace. We never returned to the East Wing, but we didn't need to. The memories of that place and the events that unfolded would stay with us forever. Crestwood High had its share of secrets, but we had helped to uncover the most important one. Emily's story was no longer just a ghost story. It was a reminder of the importance of seeking the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And for that, we would always remember her. Online dating had always seemed like a fun and easy way to meet new people. After a string of failed relationships, I decided to give Tinder a try. Scrolling through profiles became a nightly routine, swiping left more often than right. Then, one evening, I matched with someone who seemed too good to be true. His name was Daniel. He had a charming smile, a well-groomed beard, and a profile filled with witty comments and adventurous photos. We started chatting, and his messages were funny, engaging, and thoughtful. It wasn't long before we decided to meet in person. Daniel suggested a popular restaurant in the city center. It was a place I had always wanted to try, so I eagerly agreed. We set a date for the following Saturday night. As the day approached, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves, hoping this would be the start of something special. Saturday arrived, and I spent hours getting ready, wanting everything to be perfect. I arrived at the restaurant a little early, my heart racing as I waited for Daniel. When he walked in, he looked even better in person, tall, confident, and impeccably dressed. He flashed that charming smile as he approached our table. The evening started off wonderfully. We ordered drinks and appetizers, and our conversation flowed effortlessly. Daniel was attentive and seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say. As the night went on, we laughed and shared stories, and I felt a connection growing between us. But as we finished our main courses, things began to take a strange turn. Daniel's demeanor shifted subtly, his eyes taking on a darker, more intense look. He started asking increasingly personal questions, probing into my past relationships and my fears. His tone was still friendly, but there was an edge to it that made me uneasy. Trying to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, I mentioned a recent hiking trip I had taken. Daniel's face lit up, and he suggested we go on a hike together the next day. I hesitated, feeling unsure about spending more time with him so soon. But his enthusiasm was infectious, and against my better judgment, I agreed. The next morning, Daniel picked me up in his sleek black car. He had chosen a trail in a remote area, far from the usual crowded spots. As we drove, the city gave way to dense forest and winding roads. The further we went, the more isolated I felt. We finally arrived at the trailhead, a secluded spot with no other cars in sight. A sense of unease settled over me, but I pushed it aside, not wanting to seem paranoid. We set off on the hike, and at first everything seemed normal. The trail was beautiful, the air crisp and clean, and Daniel was charming as ever. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, I started to feel increasingly anxious. Daniel's behavior grew more erratic. He would walk ahead, then stop suddenly, turning to watch me with an inscrutable expression. He asked strange questions about my family and friends, probing into my personal life in a way that felt invasive. We reached a clearing, and Daniel suggested we take a break. I sat on a fallen log, trying to calm my racing heart. Daniel stood nearby, staring into the trees, a strange smile playing on his lips. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" he asked, his voice low and unsettling. I laughed nervously, trying to brush off the question. "Not really. Why do you ask?" He turned to face me, his eyes dark and intense. "Because sometimes in places like this you never know what's out there, watching, waiting." A chill ran down my spine, and I stood up, ready to head back. "I think we've had enough for today. Let's go." Daniel's smile vanished, replaced by a look of annoyance. "What's the rush? We have plenty of time." I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to get away. "No, really. I think we should go." Without another word, I started walking back the way we came. Daniel followed, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. The return trip felt longer, the forest closing in around us. My mind raced, fear taking hold as I replayed every unsettling moment of our time together. Suddenly, Daniel grabbed my arm, pulling me to a stop. His grip was strong, and his eyes bore into mine. "Why are you so scared?" he asked, his voice cold. I wrenched my arm free, my voice trembling. "Let go of me, Daniel. This isn't funny." He raised his hands in mock surrender, a twisted smile on his face. "Fine, fine. Don't be so dramatic." We continued walking, the tension between us palpable. I kept my distance, ready to run the first sign of danger. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I got in quickly, locking the door behind me. The drive back was silent and tense. Daniel's charming facade had completely dissolved, replaced by a menacing presence that made my skin crawl. When we reached my apartment, I got out of the car without a word, walking quickly to the entrance. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back to see Daniel watching me, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating look. Once inside, I locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, my heart pounding. I blocked Daniel's number and deleted his profile from my Tinder account, vowing never to use the app again. That night I barely slept, haunted by the memory of his dark, unsettling gaze. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I changed my routine, avoiding places we had talked about and staying in crowded areas. But the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder of the danger I had narrowly escaped. Months passed, and I slowly began to move on, pushing the experience to the back of my mind. Then, one evening, I received a message on social media from a stranger. It was a woman named Rachel, and her story sent chills down my spine. Rachel had matched with Daniel on Tinder a few months after our encounter. Her experience mirrored mine, charming at first, then increasingly unsettling. She had gone on a hike with M, just like I had, but her story ended differently. Daniel had become aggressive, and she had barely escaped with her life. She had reported him to the authorities, but they had yet to locate him. The realization that I wasn't alone in my experience was both comforting and terrifying. Daniel was still out there, using Tinder to find new victims. I shared my story with Rachel, and together, we spread the word, warning others about the danger lurking behind his charming facade. The encounter with Daniel left a lasting impact on me. It was a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that danger can lurk where you least expect it. I became more cautious, trusting my instincts and prioritizing my safety above all else. To this day, I can't shake the memory of Daniel's dark, calculating eyes. The experience has made me wary of online dating, and I always keep my guard up. It's a lesson learned the hard way, but one that has made me stronger and more vigilant. The night shift had always been a part of my routine. Driving for Uber in the bustling city meant that my workday often started when the rest of the world was winding down. It was a quiet Friday night when I picked up a ride request from a part of town that had a reputation for being a bit shady. My name is Alex, and this is the night that changed everything. The request came in just after midnight from an address I wasn't familiar with. The passenger's name was Lisa, and the pickup location was an old, run-down apartment complex on the edge of the city. I accepted the ride and made my way there, the GPS guiding me through the dimly lit streets. When I arrived, the place looked deserted. The flickering street lights cast eerie shadows across the cracked pavement, and the silence was almost deafening. I checked the app again to make sure I was at the right location. After a few minutes, a woman emerged from the building, her face partially obscured by the hood of her coat. She moved quickly, almost nervously, towards the car. "Lisa," I called out as I rolled down the window. She nodded, her eyes darting around as she slid into the back seat. "Yes, thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I gave her a polite nod and started the trip. The destination was a house on the outskirts of the city, about a 20-minute drive. As we pulled away, I tried to make some small talk to lighten the mood. "Late night, huh?" I said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, and she seemed tense. She nodded again, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery. "Yeah, something like that." Sensing her reluctance to talk, I focused on the road. The route took us through a series of narrow, winding streets, each one darker and more deserted than the last. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional distant bark of a dog. About 10 minutes into the ride, Lisa's phone rang. She answered it quickly, her voice hushed. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but her tone was urgent, almost pleading. After a few moments, she hung up and leaned forward. "Can you take a different route?" she asked, her voice trembling. I frowned, checking the GPS. "Sure, but it might take a bit longer. Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I need to avoid someone." I didn't press for details. It wasn't my place to pry. I changed the route and continued driving, the atmosphere in the car growing increasingly tense. We drove in silence for a while until we reached a long, deserted stretch of road. The street lights were sparse, and the darkness seemed to close in around us. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car appeared in my rearview mirror, its headlights blindingly bright. It was approaching fast, too fast. I glanced at Lisa, who had turned pale. "Is that the person you're avoiding?" I asked. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, please, drive faster." My heart started pounding as I pressed down on the accelerator. The car behind us kept gaining, its headlights illuminating the interior of my car. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins as I swerved through the streets, trying to lose the pursuer. Despite my efforts, the other car stayed close. Lisa was visibly shaking now, her hands clutching the seat. "Please, don't let them catch us," she whispered, her voice cracking. I had to think fast. We were approaching an intersection, and I made a sharp turn onto a narrow side street, hoping to lose the other car. The pursuer followed, but the street was too narrow for them to keep up the same speed. I took another sharp turn, then another, until we finally emerged onto a main road. The other car was gone. I slowed down, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. "I think we lost them," I said, my voice shaky. Lisa let out a sigh of relief, but her eyes were still filled with fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what you just saved me from." I wanted to ask more, but I sensed that she wasn't ready to talk about it. We continued in silence, and I finally pulled up to her destination, a small, unassuming house on a quiet street. As she got out of the car, she turned to me. "Thank you again," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I owe you my life." Before I could respond, she disappeared into the house, leaving me with more questions than answers. I drove away, my mind racing. Who was she running from? What had happened? The next day, I couldn't shake the events of the previous night. I decided to do some research, hoping to find some answers. What I discovered was chilling. The address where I had picked up Lisa was linked to a series of disturbing incidents. There had been reports of kidnappings, assaults, and even murders in that area. The car that had chased us matched the description of a vehicle involved in several of these cases. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Lisa had narrowly escaped something terrible, and I had unknowingly been a part of it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how lucky we had been to get away. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night began to fade. But then, one evening, I received a message through the Uber app. It was from Lisa. She wanted to meet and thank me in person. Despite my apprehension, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop in a different part of town. She looked much better than the last time I had seen her, but there was still a shadow of fear in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said as we sat down. I wanted to explain what happened that night. She told me about her ex-boyfriend, a man who had become increasingly violent and controlling. She had tried to leave him, but he had threatened her, saying he would never let her go. That night she had finally managed to escape, but he had found her. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my life." I listened, my heart heavy with the weight of her story. I was glad I had been able to help, but the reality of how close we had come to danger was sobering. As we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a part of something much bigger than a simple Uber ride. The experience had changed me, making me more aware of the darkness that sometimes lurked just beneath the surface of everyday life. Driving home that night, I realized that the world was full of unseen dangers and hidden stories, and sometimes you find yourself caught in the middle of them, whether you're ready or not. The shoot for The Conjuring was in full swing, and the cast and crew were deeply immersed in the world of the supernatural. The movie was based on the real-life experiences of Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators, which gave it an added layer of authenticity and terror. One evening, we were filming a particularly intense scene in the old farmhouse that served as the main set. The air was thick with anticipation as Vera Farmiga, who played Lorraine Warren, and Patrick Wilson, who portrayed Ed Warren, prepared for their roles. The scene involved a seance, a central element in the movie's plot. As the cameras rolled, Vera began to channel the emotions and fear of her character. The room seemed to grow colder, and an uneasy silence fell over the set. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. At first, we thought it was a technical glitch, but the flickering persisted, growing more erratic and intense. The director called for a break, and the crew scrambled to check the equipment. Everything appeared to be in working order, yet the lights continued to behave unpredictably. The atmosphere was tense, and a sense of unease spread among us. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned, as if it were alive, reacting to the disturbance. During the break, Vera pulled me aside. Her face was pale, and her eyes wide with fear. "Something's not right here," she whispered. I felt a presence, something dark and malevolent. She described a feeling of being watched, of an oppressive force bearing down on her as she tried to perform the seance scene. Her words sent chills down my spine. Vera was known for her professionalism and dedication, not for being easily spooked. I knew she wasn't imagining things. I had felt it to the core, the sense of being watched. We decided to keep this to ourselves, not wanting to alarm the rest of the crew. We resumed filming, but the strange occurrences continued. Props moved on their own, and unexplained cold spots appeared in various parts of the set. The crew reported hearing whispers and footsteps when no one else was around. The farmhouse, with its creaky floors and shadowy corners, seemed to amplify every sound, every sense of dread. One night, after a particularly grueling day of shooting, I stayed behind to review some footage. The rest of the crew had gone home, and the farmhouse was eerily quiet. As I watched the scenes play out on the monitor, I noticed something odd in the background. A shadowy figure, barely visible, seemed to move behind Vera during the seance scene. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or a camera glitch, but the figure appeared in multiple takes, always in the same place. My heart raced as I realized this was no ordinary shadow. It had a human shape, but its movements were unnatural, almost predatory. I felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct warning me of danger. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I rewound the footage and enhanced the image. The figure became clearer, revealing a gaunt, spectral face with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I felt a chill run down my spine, and the air around me grew colder. I knew I wasn't alone. Gathering my courage, I called Patrick and Vera to the set the next day. I showed them the footage, and their reactions mirrored my own. Vera's face turned ashen, and Patrick's jaw tightened. We all knew what this meant. The presence Vera had felt was real, and it had manifested on camera. We decided to consult Lorraine Warren herself. Despite her advanced age, she agreed to visit the set and perform a cleansing ritual. Lorraine arrived, her presence bringing a sense of calm and reassurance. She moved through the farmhouse with quiet authority, her eyes taking in every detail. Lorraine began the ritual, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. As she moved through the house, she paused in the room where we had filmed the seance. "This is where it is strongest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We watched in silence as Lorraine continued her prayers. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable tension, and for a moment it felt as if the very walls of the farmhouse were closing in on us. Suddenly there was a loud crash, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, we heard a low, guttural growl. Fear gripped us, but Lorraine remained calm, her voice steady as she commanded the presence to leave. Slowly, the oppressive force began to lift, and the air grew warmer. The candles flickered back to life, casting a gentle glow that dispelled the shadows. Lorraine finished the ritual and assured us that the presence had been banished. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and for the first time in days, the farmhouse felt like just an old, creaky building rather than a haunted house. We thanked Lorraine profusely, her calm demeanor and spiritual strength a beacon of hope. The rest of the shoot went smoothly, the strange occurrences all but disappearing. We completed the film, and The Conjuring went on to become a massive success. But for those of us who were there, the experience left an indelible mark. The fear, the sense of being watched, the supernatural occurrences, they were real, and they had tested our courage and faith in ways we could never have imagined. Years later, I still think about that farmhouse and the shadowy figure captured on film. It serves as a reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown, a testament to the power of belief and the strength of the human spirit in the face of the inexplicable. The haunting of the Conjuring set was more than just a story. It was a profound encounter with the supernatural, one that I will carry with me forever. It was an ordinary Tuesday night, and I was settling into my usual routine after a long day at work. I lived alone in a small, cozy house in the suburbs, a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. My house wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine a sanctuary where I felt safe and secure. After dinner, I curled up on the couch with a book, the soft hum of the TV in the background. The hours slipped by, and soon it was time for bed. I went through my nightly ritual, locking the doors, checking the windows, and making sure everything was secure. Satisfied, I headed to my bedroom and drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a strange sound of faint, almost imperceptible creak coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, a common occurrence in an older home like mine. But as I lay there, straining to hear, the sound came again, louder this time. It was the unmistakable creak of floorboards under the weight of a person. My heart began to race, and I sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the house. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. Whispering to the operator, I explained that someone was in my house. The operator assured me that help was on the way and advised me to stay hidden and quiet. I crept out of bed and quietly locked the bedroom door, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from my nightstand, my only means of defense, and retreated to the closet, closing the door behind me. I crouched in the darkness, straining to hear any sign of the intruder. The footsteps grew louder, moving through the house with an eerie precision. They paused outside my bedroom door, and I held my breath, praying that the intruder wouldn't find me. The doorknob rattled, and I could hear the soft click of the lock being tested. My mind raced with fear, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, ready to defend myself if necessary. The door creaked open, and the footsteps entered my bedroom. The sound was deafening in the silence of the house, each step a reminder of the danger lurking just outside the closet door. I could hear the intruder moving around the room, opening drawers and rifling through my belongings. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, my body tense with fear. The intruder moved closer to the closet, and I braced myself, ready to fight for my life. Just as the footsteps reached the closet door, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The intruder froze, then turned and fled the room, the sound of their hurried footsteps fading as they raced down the stairs. I stayed hidden until I heard the front door burst open and the police call out, announcing their presence. Relief washed over me as I emerged from the closet, my legs weak and shaky. The officers quickly searched the house, but the intruder was gone, leaving no trace behind. The police took my statement and assured me they would do everything they could to find the intruder. They advised me to stay with a friend or family member for the night, but I was too shaken to think clearly. I called my sister, and she came to pick me up, offering a comforting presence as I tried to process what had happened. The days that followed were a blur of fear and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the memory of those footsteps haunting my every thought. I installed new locks, security cameras, and even a security system, but the sense of safety I once felt in my home was gone. Weeks turned into months, and while the intruder was never caught, the frequency of my nightmares began to fade. Life slowly returned to normal, though I remained hypervigilant, always double-checking locks and scanning my surroundings. The experience left me scarred, a constant reminder of the fragility of the safety we often take for granted. One evening, nearly a year later, I was watching TV when a news story caught my attention. A man had been arrested in a neighboring town, caught in the act of breaking into a home. The police believed he was responsible for a string of home invasions in the area, including mine. The sight of his face on the screen sent a shiver down my spine, but there was also a sense of closure. Knowing that the intruder was behind bars brought a measure of peace, though the fear and vigilance remained. I learned to take precautions, but I also learned to reclaim my life and my home. The experience taught me the importance of being prepared and trusting my instincts, a lesson I would carry with me always. To this day, I still listen for those creaks and footsteps in the night. But now, instead of fear, they remind me of my strength and resilience. My home is once again a sanctuary, a place where I can feel safe and secure, knowing that I have faced my fears and come out stronger on the other side. I never believed in ghosts, not until I started working at old millworks. My name is Tom, and I took a job as a night shift supervisor at the factory to make some extra money while I was in college. The factory had been around for over a century, producing textiles and fabrics for various industries. It was an imposing brick building with tall windows and an air of desolation that seemed to cling to it. My first few nights were uneventful, filled with a hum of machinery and the occasional chatter of the night crew. The factory was massive, with long, dark corridors and a maze of storage rooms that seemed to go on forever. There were always stories circulating among the workers about strange occurrences, but I dismissed them as just that, stories. One night, about a month into my job, I was making my usual rounds when I heard a noise coming from one of the old, unused sections of the factory. It sounded like faint whispers, barely audible over the clanking of the machines. I brushed it off as my imagination and continued my patrol. But the whispers persisted. Each night, they grew louder and more insistent. I mentioned it to one of my co-workers, an older man named Bill, who had been with the factory for decades. "You've heard them too, huh?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "That part of the factory is haunted. Always has been." I laughed it off, but Bill's expression remained serious. "I'm telling you, Tom, there are things in this place that can't be explained. Be careful." That night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate the source of the whispers. Armed with a flashlight and my skepticism, I ventured into the old section of the factory. The air grew colder as I moved further in, and the whispers grew louder. I followed the sound to a large storage room filled with old machinery and dusty crates. The whispers seemed to be coming from a dark corner. As I approached, my flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of me. A woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow, stood there, staring at me. She wore an old-fashioned dress, and her hair was disheveled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The room grew colder, and I could see my breath in the air. Terrified, I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The woman disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, and the whispers ceased. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out of the room, not stopping until I was back in the well-lit, bustling part of the factory. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen, fearing they would think I was crazy, but I couldn't shake the image of the ghostly woman from my mind. Over the next few weeks, I started digging into the history of the factory, hoping to find some explanation. I discovered that in the early 1900s, a young woman named Eliza had worked at the factory. She was rumored to have had an affair with the factory owner, Mr. Hargrove, a married man with a reputation for being ruthless. When Eliza found out she was pregnant, she confronted Mr. Hargrove, but he refused to acknowledge the child or leave his wife. Heartbroken and desperate, Eliza took her own life in the very storage room where I had seen her ghost. Her death was quickly covered up, and the factory continued to operate as if nothing had happened. But the workers knew, and the story of Eliza's tragic end was passed down through generations. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to try and communicate with Eliza's spirit. I needed to know if there was something I could do to help her find peace. One night I returned to the storage room, this time with a voice recorder and a lantern. "Eliza," I called out, my voice trembling, "I know what happened to you. If you're here, please give me a sign." The room grew colder, and the whispers started again, this time clearer. "Help me," the voice said. "What can I do?" I asked, my breath visible in the freezing air. There was a long silence, and Then I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Eliza's ghost, her eyes filled with sorrow. She pointed to a dusty old ledger on a nearby shelf. I opened it and found detailed records of the factory's operations, including a ledger entry that mentioned her death, labeled as an accident. I took the ledger to the local historical society, and together we worked to bring Eliza's story to light. An article was published revealing the truth about her tragic fate and Mr. Hargrove's role in it. The factory owners, facing public backlash, agreed to erect a memorial in her honor. After the memorial was erected, the strange occurrences in the factory ceased. The whispers stopped, and the air no longer felt cold and heavy. It was as if Eliza had finally found peace. I continued working at old millworks until I graduated, but I never forgot Eliza and the night I came face to face with her ghost. It taught me that some stories demand to be told, and some spirits cannot rest until they are. It all started when I moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street. My name is Karen, and I had just gone through a tough breakup. The house was meant to be a fresh start, a place where I could gather myself and move on. It was quaint with a charm that spoke of history and character, but it also had a reputation in the neighborhood. People whispered about strange noises and odd occurrences, but I dismissed them as mere gossip. The first few nights were peaceful. I spent my time unpacking, getting settled, and enjoying the quiet. Then, one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be mice or some other critters, but the sound persisted. It grew louder and more distinct each night. One evening, I decided to investigate, armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination. I followed the sound to a small, hidden door in the basement that I hadn't noticed before. It was old and covered in cobwebs, almost as if it hadn't been opened in years. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. As I opened the door, a cold draft swept through the basement, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The room beyond was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. In the corner, I saw a large, ornate mirror covered in a thick layer of dust. The scratching sound seemed to be coming from behind it. I approached the mirror cautiously, wiping away the dust to reveal a dark, reflective surface. As I stared into it, I felt a chill run down my spine. My reflection seemed off. It was as if something else was looking back at me, something malevolent. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, and the room grew deathly silent. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, and hurried upstairs. That night, I had a terrible nightmare. I dreamed of a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with glowing red eyes. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Over the next few days, things only got worse. I started hearing whispers, low and unintelligible, coming from the walls and the mirror. Objects moved on their own, and I felt an oppressive presence in the house, as if I was never truly alone. I knew I needed help. I reached out to a local priest, Father Thomas, who had a reputation for dealing with supernatural occurrences. He came to the house, his expression grave as he listened to my story. After a thorough inspection, he confirmed my worst fears. The house was possessed by a malevolent spirit. This spirit is ancient and powerful, Father Thomas explained. It feeds on fear and despair. You mustn't engage with it. We need to perform an exorcism to cleanse the house. The exorcism was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the days leading up to it in a state of constant anxiety. The entity grew more aggressive, making its presence known with violent outbursts. One night I woke up to find myself unable to move, pinned down by an invisible force. The shadowy figure from my dreams appeared again, whispering threats and promises of torment. When the day of the exorcism finally arrived, Father Thomas and two other priests arrived at the house, armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayer books. They began the ritual in the basement, where the presence was strongest. The air grew thick and heavy as they chanted, and the room seemed to darken. The entity fought back, causing the walls to shake and the temperature to drop. I watched in terror as the priests struggled to maintain their composure, their voices rising in a desperate plea for divine intervention. At the climax of the exorcism, the mirror in the basement shattered, releasing a deafening scream that echoed through the house. The oppressive presence lifted, and a sense of calm returned. Father Thomas assured me that the spirit was banished, but warned that the house still carried a residual energy. I stayed in the house, hoping that the worst was over, but the experience had left a mark on me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I often found myself staring at the spot where the mirror had once stood. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and I felt a lingering fear that the entity might return. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange on my bathroom mirror. Written in the fog of the shower steam were the words, "I'm still here." My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I called Father Thomas immediately, and he came to the house once again. He performed a blessing and placed protective symbols around the home, reassuring me that I was safe. But the words on the mirror were a stark reminder that some things never truly leave. Despite the continued unease, I tried to resume my normal life. Months passed, and the incidents became less frequent. I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the spirit had been driven away for good. But then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a familiar scratching sound coming from the walls. My blood ran cold, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The entity had returned, and it was more determined than ever. Desperate, I sought the help of a renowned paranormal investigator, Dr. Evelyn Moore. She arrived with her team, equipped with advanced technology to capture and understand the spirit's activity. They set up cameras, audio recorders, and other devices throughout the house. For 3 nights, Dr. Moore and her team stayed in the house, documenting the phenomena. They captured chilling evidence, footsteps, disembodied voices, and even apparitions. The entity seemed to be growing stronger, feeding off the fear and attention. Dr. Moore concluded that the spirit was not just a restless ghost, but a demon drawn to the house by the negative energy of past tragedies. She proposed a radical solution, a complete cleansing ritual, one that required not only spiritual intervention, but also a psychological approach to confront the demon's hold over me. The ritual took place over several days, involving intense meditation, the burning of sage, and the recitation of ancient prayers. Dr. Moore guided me through confronting my deepest fears, urging me to take control and reject the demon's influence. On the final night, as we performed the last rites, the house seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. Shadows danced on the walls, and the temperature dropped to a bone-chilling cold. The demon fought back with a ferocity I had never experienced, but I stood my ground, repeating the words Dr. Moore had taught me. At the climax of the ritual, a blinding light filled the room, and a deafening roar echoed through the house. I felt a surge of strength and defiance, and with a final shout, the presence was expelled. The house fell silent. The oppressive energy lifted. Dr. Moore and her team were exhausted but triumphant. The demon was banished, and the house was finally free. I stayed in the house for a few more months, gradually reclaiming my life and sense of peace. The nightmares ceased, and the scratching sounds were gone. I knew I had faced something truly evil and survived. Eventually, I decided to move, leaving the house on Maple Street behind. It was time for a new beginning, free from the shadows of the past. I found a small apartment in a different part of town, and life slowly returned to normal. But I'll never forget the haunting of old millworks and the demon that once called it home. It taught me that some battles are fought not just with courage, but with the strength of the human spirit.